Hi everyone, good afternoon and welcome to Community Law and Mediation's webinar on understanding the requirements of Ireland's carbon budget programme and what our future government must do to close the emissions gap. My name is Clodagh Daly. I manage Community Law and Mediation's Centre for Environmental Justice, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Hannah Daly and Alan Brady, who have both generously offered their expert legal, policy and scientific insights for today's session. But before I hand over to our expert speakers, I'm just going to provide a brief introduction to community law mediation and our work on climate change for those of you who are new to us. So community law mediation was set up in 1975 as part of the campaign for civil legal aid. Our offices are based in Clodagh in North Dublin and in Limerick, but we operate nationally. And our primary services are our free legal advice clinics. So those run across a range of areas, including housing, employment, social welfare, equality, children's law. And then in 2021, we established Ireland's first ever Centre for Environmental Justice. As we know, climate change is one of the greatest threats to human rights and poses a serious risk to life, health, food, and an adequate standard of living for individuals and communities across Ireland and the world. We know also that communities who experience disadvantage or marginalisation are often more vulnerable to the effects of climate change, pollution, and other environmental harms. One of the primary goals of community law mediation and the Centre for Environmental Justice is to empower and equip individuals, community groups, and organisations to challenge environmental injustice using the law. So in the context of today's webinar, exploring the requirements of Ireland's Climate Act, and what needs to be done to meet those requirements, I thought it might be timely to provide a brief overview of some of the climate cases that we are taking. So the first case that we launched is in relation to the Climate Action Plan 2023. So Ireland's Climate Act requires the government to produce a climate action plan, and essentially this lays out a roadmap of actions to reduce Ireland's emissions in line with our legal obligations. We are representing Friends of the Irish Environment and its legal challenge to the government's 2023 Climate Action Plan. And this challenge essentially claims that the Climate Action Plan fails to show with a sufficient level of specificity that the plan and its annex of actions will in fact reduce greenhouse gas emissions in line with Ireland's legally binding carbon budget. And this, we and Friends of the Irish Environment claim, is a breach of the government's legal duties under its Climate Act. That case will be heard in January, from the 28th of January next year, which is coming up soon. So keep an eye on our social media for more information about that case over the coming weeks. We are also challenging the Climate Action Plan 2024 alongside a grandfather, a youth climate activist, and a child. And in this case, we argue that the Climate Action Plan 2024 is not in compliance with the first carbon budget or the carbon budget programme. And in addition, we argue that the Climate Action Plan 2024 violates the fundamental rights of 3 individual applicants, marginalised group that we work with in our organisation, and future generations as protected by the Constitution, the European Convention of Human Rights, and the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. And essentially through these cases, we're trying to, I suppose, bring forward the idea that climate action must match ambition. And so we hope that the climate action plans will be revised to set out a sufficiently clear roadmap for effective climate action in line with Ireland's legal obligations. And that's to ensure that a just transition can actually be planned and delivered. And it's to protect the rights of both present and future generations. But I'm delighted now to hand over to Alan Brady. So Alan is a graduate of Trinity College Dublin, the London School of Economics and Political Science, and the King's Inns. Alan has worked as a legal researcher at the Law Reform Commission and has taught at LSE and University College London. His previous teaching experience includes criminal law, human rights, international criminal law, and criminology. And he's currently teaching critical perspectives on law in the master's course and the judicial review and human rights module on the LLM course as well. And Alan is a practicing barrister. So Alan, I'm delighted to hand over to you, and thanks so much for giving us your time today.
No problem. Thank you so much, Clodagh, for that warm welcome. I'm very grateful to you. I was going to share a PowerPoint, which I'm trying to do. There we go. Is this going to work? Let's find out. And think we're off. Are we at the races? Is
Yes.
everybody seeing? Wonderful. This is magnificent. Um, okay, so as Clodagh said, I'm a barrister. That's my profession. I also teach in the law school in Trinity College. This is the only thing that I've done with my adult life. The last time I studied anything that wasn't law was my leaving certificate. So I am not a climate scientist. I do not hold myself out as a climate scientist. The role that I'm in a position to play here today is to talk about the climate legislation upon which the carbon budget program is founded and how those legal mechanisms operate. Um, what I'm going to do is just talk about the legislation itself briefly, talk about the carbon budget program and what that means, and very specifically how that is brought about, which bits of the government are responsible for making it, and how it then affects subsequent government policy. And then I also want to talk a little bit about how we count carbon and the issue of evidence and litigation very briefly, because I don't really know how to count carbon. But at some point, I'm going to have to explain to a judge how to account for carbon, and that poses its own difficulty. Um, Not that judges are not incredibly polite people, it's just most of them have the same training as I do. A brief disclaimer at the start, I am a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer. So if anybody thinks that today is a day to get case-specific legal advice, it is not. And I realize that that is a little bit of a prickly thing to start with, where I'm supposed to be welcoming and open, but I've been burned by this before, so I'm just saying at the very beginning, um, the legislation I'm going to talk about, as Claude has already referenced, is the subject of multiple live court cases. So there's the two that CLM are involved in, but we can certainly expect a lot more. This is, in some ways, kind of a novel piece of legislation, but even were it not a novel piece of legislation, it is in the nature of our legal system that, with the best will in the world, no piece of law can contemplate every possible outcome in advance. So they get teased out in specific cases. That's how law works. It is to some extent how language works. It's not something that we can necessarily get around. It's baked into the system. I realize that lots of people don't like lawyers because they say things like that, but it's also true. And if you don't like lawyers, I guarantee I spend more time with lawyers than you do. So, me rather than judging me. I'm going to make a kind of an educated assessment of very recent legislation, and what I think it means and how I think it's going to function. This is an educated assessment, but of course, I might be mistaken. As has been mentioned, there's two cases currently working their way through the courts on these issues. It is entirely possible that there will be judgments in 2 years' time that will have a very different interpretation of all of this than I do. So this is an educated guess. I want to think particularly for my purposes today about the way these public powers are structured across different governmental bodies, particularly the Oireachtas, the Minister, the government, and the Climate Change Advisory Council. Those are the four bodies that have input into this. And I just want to kind of tease out exactly how that operates, because I think that's useful when thinking about policy, because often we are frustrated at a lack of action. Certainly the fact that anybody has been, signing up for webinars from a Centre for Environmental Justice suggests that, broadly speaking, unless you're really committed to the sort of principle of entryism, you're probably spending your lunchtime doing this today because on some level you would like this situation to be improved. But when we are thinking about the ways in which public bodies do things, it is important to understand not only their individual obligations, but their relationships to each other, because that is a really big part of how the legal framework operates. So the key piece of legislation is the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act of 2015, which I'm going to refer to throughout of the 2015 Act. It was amended quite substantially in 2021 by the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Amendment Act of 2021. The original requirement, the original Section 4 in the original text had this requirement of a thing called a National Mitigation Plan. That was amended very substantially in 2021, and in the run-up to that, there had been this very significant court case which went all the way to the Supreme Court, the Friends of the Irish Environment and the Government of Ireland. And what the Supreme Court found in that case was that the National Mitigation Plan was unlawful because it was insufficiently specific. Now, it's worth just pausing for a moment to think about what that means. There was a piece of legislation passed by the Oireachtas It placed an obligation on the government to adopt a plan, and the legislation had certain requirements in terms of what the plan had to say. And because the plan wasn't sufficiently detailed, it was found to be unlawful. Now, again, that was remedied relatively quickly. The new Section 4 requires two things: a climate action plan and a national long-term climate strategy. The minister prepares the climate action plan and national long-term climate strategy. The government approves it. The minister and the government are two different things. So the minister is a corporation sole. The minister is the head of a government department. People working in the government department work in the name of the minister. The government is all of the 15 ministers, including the Taoiseach, sitting around the cabinet table and making collective decisions which they're entitled to do confidentially, or at least their discussions are confidential. Those are two very distinct and different parts of the government. The government in the kind of loose sense. When we say government here, and when government is referenced in legislation, it means that very particular constitutional body around the cabinet table. So the minister is responsible for preparing those, which is done with the support of the department and various other bodies. The government approves it. As has been mentioned, the 23 and 24 climate action plans are currently the subject of litigation. The other big amendment from the 2021 legislation is the insertion of a new 6A, 6B, 6C, and 6D, which introduces the carbon budgets. Now, you will see that I've used capital letters there. That is not by accident. The usual methodology in Irish legislation is that the numbering goes section is a number, subsection is a number, and then after that you usually go to letters, but they'd be lowercase. You might have section 6(1)(b), where you insert extra sections into something by amending legislation. You call them with the capital. So that is on purpose, and it's worth remembering if you're writing angry correspondence to ministers. The key thing about the new Section 4 is that the minister is required to ensure that the Climate Action Plan and the National Long-Term Climate Strategy are consistent with the Carbon Budget Programme. So the word there is consistent, not compliant, not in accordance with, not have regard to, it's consistent. The Carbon Budget Programme, as I'll come to in a moment, is not just each individual carbon budget, it is a batch of 3 of them at a time. So that is quite a significant threshold, because it means whatever comes out of the minister's process and the government's approval for the purposes of getting a climate action plan and a national long-term climate strategy, they have to be consistent with. And that is by legal standards, that's a relatively high threshold. Now, again, that threshold is being imposed by the Oireachtas through the legislation. So the Oireachtas passes the laws, the minister and the government comply with the laws. The minister is fairly closely bound by the laws. The government has an existence in the constitution that is separate and distinct from the Oireachtas' lawmaking power. But for our purposes today, I think it's pretty clear that that's very solid. The starting point of the Carbon Budget Programme is a proposal from the Advisory Council. So there's a Climate Change Advisory Council set up under the 2015 Act, and that proposes the carbon budget. So again, we're being careful about the verbs we're using here. They put together a plan and they propose it. It gets proposed to the minister. There are essentially 3 carbon budgets that have been proposed and approved, and they are for these 3 separate periods of time. All of 2021 to 2025, all of 2026 to 2030, all of 2031 to 2035. Those 3 put together make up the carbon budget programme. There is a requirement in section 6A, subsection 5, that the advisory council, that at the proposal stage, the first 2 budgets, so the budgets up to and including December 2030, would have a 51% reduction in total emissions in December 2030 relative to December 2018. At the legislative level, that is an obligation that has been placed on the Advisory Council. The Act only puts it on the Advisory Council. The Advisory Council has to include it in its proposal, but as we'll see in a moment, there's other mechanisms involved beyond the Advisory Council in terms of how the carbon budget, or the final carbon budget programme is actually put together. And because the first and second ones have now been proposed and those have been signed off on, to some extent that is now effectively defunct. Now, again, I'm not suggesting for a second that we shouldn't be aiming for 51% by 2030. I'm not saying it's not good policy. I'm saying as a matter of law, the legal requirement here was that the advisory council would make sure the first two budgets that they proposed met that standard. And so that's now been done, and we're moving past that now. Once it's been proposed by the advisory council, it then goes to the Minister of the Environment. The Minister can amend it and finalise it. So again, the first thing to say is the Minister is not bound by whatever the Climate Change Advisory Council has proposed. The Minister can change it and can change it substantially. The 51% by 2030 requirement is on the Advisory Council. It's not on the Minister. Now, as it happens, as far as I can tell, and again, as we'll get to in a minute, I'm very bad at counting carbon. As far as I can tell, the first two carbon budgets do comply with that target. But the Minister is entitled to amend and finalise it if he or she wants to. The Minister then submits it to the government, and the government either approves it or approves it subject to modifications. It's important to note a couple of really key things here. First of all, the government has the power to modify it. The government doesn't have the power to reject it. Now, in principle, the government could modify it by, changing it to one line that says Ireland's carbon budget for the next 5 years allows us to emit, 500 megatons of CO2 per year, whatever it is, right? So there's nothing in the legislation that necessarily restrains that. But the government is expected to either approve it or approve it subject to modifications. And again, I stress, when we talk about the government here, I am talking very specifically about the executive branch of the state within the meaning of the separation of powers under Article 28 of the Constitution. It has a very specific defined meaning. So the Oireachtas, which is a separate branch of the state, has given this obligation to the government to approve or approve subject to modifications, whatever has made its way to the government through the Climate Change Advisory Council and the Minister. The executive power of the state has an existence above and beyond the Oireachtas' lawmaking power, but the fact that the government is required to sign off on this gives it the imprimatur of the executive branch of the state. So although they have a lot of power in terms of what they do, the government is required to take this step. And so that means we have, a certain amount of endorsement across the various arms of government. We then get on to approval by the Dáil and the Seanad. So after the government has approved it, it's laid before each house of the Oireachtas, and then they consider a motion to approve it. If both houses approve it, then it's passed. If they don't, then the Minister consults with the Advisory Council and the rest of government and makes amendments, and then it gets laid before the House of the Oireachtas again. In thinking about all of that process, we have this expert group, the Climate Change Advisory Council. They put together the detail, the initial proposal. It goes to the Minister considers it and can amend it. Then the Minister puts it to the government approves it, then the Dáil and the Seanad approve it. That's very unusual as a structure for policy making in Irish terms. Usually, if there's policy requirements of this type, they're placed on an individual minister, and the minister comes up with whatever the plan is, and away you go. Or the local authority comes up with the development plan, or the local authority comes up with the traveller accommodation programme, whatever it might be. So in the way that this is structured, it's quite innovative because it ensures that you have multiple parts of the government being consulted and dealing with this and all signing off on it. So what you end up with at the end is something that the Minister, the government, and the Oireachtas are all essentially happy with. Now, bear in mind, all of this, the entire act, came from the Oireachtas. So the Oireachtas is the one that has the power to make laws for the state, and the Oireachtas is essentially telling itself to sign off on things at a later stage. It is a very belt and braces approach to ensuring sign off, but what it leaves at the end is something that you can, generally speaking, be pretty happy with, in the sense that it has a very significant amount of legitimacy and approval at multiple levels. It is important to note, again, for non-lawyers, this is all completely distinct from international law, which functions in a very, very different way. And I'm certainly not going to get through it in the short amount of time left to me here today. The three budgets that we have that make up the current carbon budget programme are measured in terms of megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. The number is 295 for the first, for the second it's 200, for the third it's 151. There is a requirement that at least 1 year before the end of the first one, whatever the current number one is, that you are making the plans for the fourth one, the next one that's going to come up at the end. Because at any given time, we should have 3 carbon budgets in place, making up a carbon budget program. So we are getting very close to 12 months out from the end of the 2025 one. And so that has to be another one for 36 to 40 coming in after that. Very briefly, just in terms of litigation evidence, judges are not climate scientists. Most judges did laws undergraduates, and the ones who didn't do laws undergraduates predominantly did arts and humanities degrees. So you get a lot of people with degrees in like history and philosophy and stuff. The hard numbers of carbon budgets are relatively easy to understand in the sense that like you can understand the number 295 if you've done primary school maths, right? But the way in which we count carbon is much, much less easy. And certainly I have in recent months spent some time in meetings with climate scientists who have been trying to explain to me how this works, and I have done a very poor job of keeping up with them. But it is important that we find some way to prove whether or not things are consistent with the carbon budget program. Because if there is litigation, if there are fights over all of this, it's all going to turn on that, whether or not things meet that standard of consistent with the carbon budget program. And the thing that has to be consistent is the climate action plan and the long-term climate strategy. So prove, I mean, as in prove in court. So you either have somebody who's willing to get in a witness box and be cross-examined, who presumably will be an expert climate scientist, or else people who are putting things on affidavit. Like our system of litigation is pretty old school. You have to actually have people coming in and proving things. That is most of what I want to say, and I understand that a lot of it's extremely depressing. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought, which is that modern physics tells us that all of our bodies are made up of little bits of star. We're all made of stars. You're enough. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Alan. That was a really comprehensive explanation of the requirements of the Act and what the carbon budget program actually means. So thanks a million. Just to remind everybody in the audience that you can ask our expert speakers questions, pop them into the chat box or the Q&A box. There'll be time for that at the end. And in the meantime, I'm delighted to hand over to Professor Hannah Daly. So Professor Daly is teaching sustainable energy and energy systems modelling at University College Cork. Her research and lecturing focus on modelling and developing sustainable pathways for the energy system, and this includes energy access, climate change, and air pollution. Hannah engages extensively with policymakers, civil society, and academia across these topics. As well as being a lead contributing author to several international agency World Energy Outlook reports, she has co-authored many peer-reviewed journal articles and several book chapters and other reports. And many of you may be aware and familiar with Hannah's work in the Irish Times. She writes a regular column called At a Time of Climate Crisis. So be sure to follow that. So thanks very much, Hannah, and I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Clodagh. Thank you, Alan. I think hopefully where you left off, Alan, I'll take up because I'm not a lawyer. None of this is legal advice, of course, but I do count carbon. I spent a lot of my day counting carbon. So I suppose a bit of background of where I fit in here. You know, I'm not a scientist of the climate system itself, this traditional understanding of what a climate scientist is, but I am an expert in a lot of the systems that give rise to greenhouse gas emissions and what the process of change within those systems has been and can be in the future to meet our carbon budgets so I study long-term, mainly focused on energy transition pathways consistent with greenhouse gas reduction. So I understand the sources of greenhouse gas emissions. I'm increasingly interested in livestock and land use change as well, and how those fit in with carbon budgets. So, you know, I'm an independent academic, of course, but I've played a role within various parts of the system that Alan described, providing evidence. A lot of our research is funded by DEC, by the Department of Climate, Energy and Communications, and I've sat on advisory committees to the Climate Advisory Council, which has provided the evidence base for our first set of carbon budgets. And for the last 18 months, I've been part of a working group for the Climate Council, which is providing evidence for the Council on its advice for the second carbon budget program, which is to come by the end of this year. And the second carbon budget program will give a finalized carbon budget 3 and a proposed carbon budget 4, so setting out the pathway in the 2030s. But none of this, prejudices the council's advice or speaks for any of those agencies that I've been involved in. I've written about various aspects of this in my column and through a blog as well. But I was speaking on a podcast last week, a local Cork podcast, about kind of the new government, or the election, the ongoing election, and what might the future for the carbon budget program be for the new election. And as I wrote in my last column, I think it's significantly at risk, or they're, especially given the insecurity, and the I suppose the geopolitical, trends, what happened in the US election. We can't take the carbon budget program for granted for various reasons. There are many ways that the government could either revise carbon budgets or amend or repeal the Climate Act. Just because carbon budgets themselves even are legally binding, having them in law doesn't mean that they will be achieved. So I want to talk a bit about, what is the gap to our carbon budgets, and why that we have a gap, and some thoughts on ways to fill the gap, both in terms of the energy transition and specific energy policies themselves, but also issues with the implementation of the Climate Act. So this graph is from the Environmental Protection Agency's latest greenhouse gas projections. So this is the counting carbon bit. And the EPA has a statutory role within the Climate Act to project the impact of proposed policies and measures under two main scenarios: the with existing measures scenario there, the WEM in the orange line, and the with additional measures there, which is the blue line. So that takes effectively all the future projected demands and policies that the government has proposed in the Climate Action Plan, and projects, quantitatively for every sector, for every year, what the greenhouse gas emissions will be. And then it has in this red X is the minus 51% target. Now, as Alan said, that 51% target is effectively is redundant. So the first two carbon budgets were proposed and then accepted by the Oireachtas, which would be consistent with a trajectory to that 51%. But now it is the cumulative carbon budgets that matter. And as you can see, we're projected to overshoot very significantly, especially the second carbon budget program with existing and then additional, more ambitious application of the proposed measures. And that's something that I'll focus on. And I want to kind of emphasize why carbon budgets matter from the physical sciences perspective. So the perspective of the climate. Why is it not 51%? Why is it not net zero that we're really aiming for? That is because these are three just very illustrative scenarios with no real numbers. All of these three scenarios get to net zero by 2050. But the early action scenario has half of the cumulative CO2 emissions of the late action scenario. So the area under the curve is half of the volume of emissions as the late action scenario. And so the early action scenario leads to half of the warming impact of the late action scenario. This is something that we really need to internalize very, very clearly, that the climate is responding to cumulative CO2 emissions. It's a bit more complicated for other greenhouse gases, but it's enough to understand this. So net zero is only the date that the climate stops getting warmer. That's a basic physical fact. So and our main obligations under the Climate Act and under international agreements is to limit cumulative global warming to a certain peak threshold, so to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and striving to limit warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And so it's the early action scenarios that are the only way in order to limit the cumulative additional CO2 and therefore the cumulative additional warming. That's why our Climate Act has cumulative carbon budgets, not just, let's say, 51% or net zero targets. And that's really important to appreciate, because we basically started the clock at 2021 in terms of our cumulative emissions. Overshooting the cumulative targets leaves very profound consequences that I don't think are being appreciated by the system. So this is actually prepared these numbers, these slides based on, I think, last year's or the projections from the EPA last year or the year before. But this is basically a simplification of the EPA's with additional measures scenario and the with existing measures scenario. And this is averaged across the 5-year periods because, you know, because this what the flexibility that the carbon budgets allow. And so we're projected to overshoot carbon budgets 1 and 2 by the orange area. I won't say what that is, but under the Climate Act, the subsequent carbon budgets have to be revised so that the overshoot of the previous carbon budgets is subtracted from the third carbon budget. Now, the third carbon budget there from 2031 is provisional. I would expect that it should be revised downwards, given what we know about how close we are to, you know, very dangerous points in global warming and so on. But this is up for the council to recommend by the end of this year and for the government to adopt. But if we, for example, in this scenario, reduce carbon budget 3 by the total projected overshoot of carbon budgets 1 and 2, there's almost nothing left. And even if that's revised downwards, it's you know, it's nothing left. So the with existing measure scenario is a more, let's say, pessimistic scenario of the achievement of the climate action plan. So pessimistic achievement of, let's say, electric vehicles. Some might say it's more realistic given the delays that we're facing in implementing many of the climate action plan measures. And so if we do that, we're overshooting by a larger amount, and the overshoot cumulatively is larger than the total carbon budget 3. Now, I would say that net zero by 2040, by 2050 is close to being achievable. Net zero by 2030, which would be required here, is absolutely not feasible. You know, it would require something like orders of magnitude more effort. It's you know, we need a lexicon of different levels of achievability here, but you know, basically this scenario on the right would leave no carbon budget room after 2030, and the risk is that this is not being properly quantified. The risk of the overshoot is not being quantified in the carbon budget program, and this leaves very significant risks. So I share with you a paper that my team published just last week, which was prompted by discussions actually last year with various experts who you know, when we spoke about these risks of overshoot, the idea was that technologies and measures will become cheaper after 2030. You know, these backlogs in planning applications, and there will be more technologies, the fuels will be more available and so on. Therefore, the overshoot is manageable because costs will come down. So this was a paper which I instinctively thought that that was not the case, but I realized that we didn't have any evidence to examine that. So we looked at the implications of overshoot, projected overshoot and undershoot of the carbon budget program, and it found that meeting the most ambitious carbon budgets consistent with different interpretations of our obligations under the Paris Agreement is largely cost effective. I must say that this just focuses on the energy system, on transport, power, buildings and industry, so not agriculture and land use. Basically, steep reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in the energy system is cost effective. It requires extremely high upfront investment in transforming our power system, transforming our energy system, retrofitting our buildings, but those costs are almost entirely paid back in the long run because we're currently consuming about 5 billion euros a year worth of oil, about 2 billion euros worth of gas. You know, the amount of money that goes into our transport system, which is extremely inefficient and car-based, you know, and this doesn't even count the avoided compliance costs of exceeding our EU targets and other many non-financial benefits, greater energy security, indigenous energy production, air pollution, and so on. What is necessary is close to full decarbonisation of electricity, buildings, transport, and industry by 2040. That means cutting fossil fuels, but it's only feasible if we start very soon and make that really upfront investment, and a focus on reducing wasteful energy demand. And wasteful energy demand, I would include having you know, dispersed car-centric transport systems and inefficient homes, along with technology transitions. And delayed action reduces the feasibility or makes completely infeasible the prospect of keeping emissions aligned with the Paris Agreement. So delayed action increased costs, increase climate damages, increases risks, for example, because the only technologies that will be available if we overshoot to this certain level is so-called carbon dioxide removal technologies. And these are mainly speculative measures. They've not been developed at scale, which literally kind of suck carbon out of the atmosphere. And they're costly and they come with risks and trade-offs and don't allow you to, I suppose, seize the opportunities of the energy transition if you take short-term measures. I'll point you to, in terms of what actually has to be done to accelerate the decarbonisation of the power system, of the energy system. I've worked recently with SEAI to just spell this out very, very simply. What does it boil down to? And 5 actions, 5 overall kind of areas of work bring us to 90% of the emission savings from the energy system required to 2030. That's decarbonising industry. So the most important is wind, solar and grid, new sources of energy to replace fossil fuels, electrifying what we can, electrifying transport and heating and industry, focusing on novel technologies for cement, and then cutting car dependency and other wasteful forms of energy. So no miracles are necessary. All of these measures are actually already available, well proven, but we're just not deploying them quickly enough. And of course, the status quo is hugely costly. So, you know, the energy transition not only gets us a safe climate, but makes us more secure, healthy. These measures can improve health, well-being, and equity, and of course drive prosperity as well. I'll leave you read those on your own. But we need to accelerate. We need to bring forward the clean energy measures. Focus not just on deploying the good stuff, but cutting the bad stuff. And often our climate policy is not doing that. And also managing energy demand, because as we're growing energy demand, for example, through data centers, we're like running up and down moving escalator. I'll leave with some of the key gaps that I see in climate policy development that I think are not being met. So first of all, our sectoral emissions ceilings remain significantly above the overall carbon budgets. So we have a commitment gap. There's an unallocated savings, which is creating a significant shortfall in planning, and there's no emissions ceiling for land use, LULUCF. So there's the potential that we will have to revise carbon budget. The government is indicating that it wants to follow the EU protocol for land use because of the uncertainty of emissions within land use, but it's creating an overall a huge uncertainty as to whether we're compliant or not with the carbon budgets. The second is that the Climate Action Plan is not developing sufficiently strong policies and measures to demonstrate the achievement of the sector emission ceilings or carbon budgets. So we have a policy gap. The third is that there's no protocol developed in the Climate Act for what should happen when the greenhouse gas inventories are revised. So as our scientific knowledge of the sources of emissions develop, emissions factors are improved and so on, the historic greenhouse gas inventory changes from year to year. Last year, the EPA's projections show that we were more on track to carbon budgets, but that was mainly because of revisions in historical inventory rather than progress in climate target. So what is the protocol for revising carbon budgets? And then there needs to be, I suppose, a distinguishment between what is progress in mitigation due to climate policy, number of retrofits, more public transport, more forestry and so on, or due to temporary market and climate events. And a lot of the progress that was achieved last year was effectively temporary, but we don't have a good way of distinguishing these things. There's ambiguity in the definition of climate neutrality by 2050 at the latest, especially how that defines how methane is treated within climate neutrality. I expect this will be the subject of a lot of discussion. And finally, we're stuck on the kind of more transformative and structural change that's necessary in the higher emitting sectors, where we don't have technology solutions like our livestock-based agriculture system, our enterprise model that's focused on data center growth, aviation, cement, and so on. Progress is stuck because I suppose there's different parts of government moving in different directions on this, and that's going to cause, I think, problems down the line, and it already has. Very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hannah. That was absolutely brilliant and really complemented Alan's presentation. So thank you very much for that. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A box, and I would encourage anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question to type it in. So Elizabeth says, thank you very much for that interesting presentation, Alan. Does the whole of government approach to approving the carbon budget mean that it gets watered down? And do you think the carbon budget program is ambitious enough? And you might have views on that latter part as well, Hannah.
Thank you for the question, Liz. I in terms of whether it's ambitious enough, I think that's probably a more appropriate question for Hannah, in the sense that I can't tell you what number gets us where we need to be. In terms of it being watered down, as I understand it, and again, I defer to Hannah's view on the numbers, what's actually come out in terms of the carbon budget programs, the three that we have, the carbon budgets that we have, the three that make up the current carbon budget program, the numbers are actually pretty good, and because of the way it's structured, where you have essentially this expert advisory council getting the ball rolling, but then working its way through these various parts of government, like it hasn't, as I understand the process by which these were obtained, it doesn't seem to have been badly watered down, and the numbers that we have, although they are in no way sufficient, for certainly for 2030 to be net zero, I I don't know enough about exactly how these exact budgets were achieved, but the thing I think about the kind of cross government approach to getting it signed off on is that once it's done, it's done. And it's very, very hard to say, oh, well, this is wrong. It has a very substantial amount of legitimacy as a legal and policy standard once it's gone through that process. And I think that that gives it weight, not just in terms of, as a lawyer going into court and arguing the CAP 23 or CAP 24 or whatever it is, if you're in a situation where you're trying to argue that a particular thing is not consistent with it, I think that that the argument in court is made stronger by the fact that there's this whole government approach. But I also think just even at the level of kind of public acceptance and legitimacy, like, you're not trying to kind of take the most ambitious targets of some international organization and say, well, why is the minister not doing more? You're kind of saying, well, the minister, the government, and the Oireachtas have all signed off on this, so just do it. Like, why are you messing around? So I think that those kinds of legitimacy things in engagement are significant. But again, I am very much a courtroom lawyer day to day and a few evenings a week. I'm a classroom lawyer. Like I'm not a policy expert. I certainly don't. Because I think I'd happily defer to. I'm sure Hannah has things to say about whether they're ambitious enough. And I'm a complete layperson on that.
Hannah, did you want to come in on that one?
Thanks. Yeah. So I suppose there's three different levels of that question of what's ambitious enough. First is the carbon budget program and the kind of national climate strategy, which is these overall carbon budgets that we have. They're probably they're some of the most ambitious in the world in terms of having a near-term decarbonization trajectory. The climate purists who are looking at at maintaining very safe or avoiding the risk of damaging global warming, and people who would emphasize very much the climate justice aspect, in that Ireland is a wealthy, high-emitting country with large capacity to cut emissions, would say that our carbon budgets themselves are too high. By some measures, by many measures, Ireland has already emitted more than its fair share of the global commons. So the carbon budget program is certainly a compromise in some, between that and what is feasible. And I have very kind of strong inverted commas between what's feasible, because that's very contingent on certain things. It's not just what's technologically feasible. So let's take the carbon budget program as it currently is. I'm not sure if the government approach is watering that down. What I suppose the main problem I see with the approach is that the sectoral emission ceilings, I suppose the part of the carbon budget pie that has been allocated to different sectors, is too large. And that is a political, I suppose, a unwillingness to impose on certain large emitting sectors. And I would say agriculture and transport are the two kind of most significant emitting sectors that are relevant here. Basically, imposing on them such small carbon budgets that it would be extremely disruptive. possibly in a good way if these policies were brought about in a way that was, fair to farmers, good for wildlife, dramatically improve public transport and so on, but that the political system and individual, I suppose, departments were not willing to commit to carbon budgets, sectoral emission ceilings consistent with the overall carbon budget. And then the third aspect is that the climate action plan, the specific policies and measures, are not ambitious enough even for the sectoral emission ceilings. So you could say that there's three different gaps. There's the carbon budget gap. We're saying that we can emit more than we should. I'd be ambivalent about that, but there's a gap in the policies and in the sectoral commitments that I would say that is due to political difficulties in imposing those. But I don't see how to get around that. Rather than shining a light on the gap and showing the cost of overshoot. And I suppose it is about hypocrisy as well that political parties have voted for carbon budgets in principle, but are not supporting the policies and measures, in fact, that are required to meet the carbon budgets. And that just needs to be highlighted at every opportunity, I think.
Great. That leads nicely to our next question. And maybe if you could just explain a little bit more about the carbon budget program's approach to agriculture and land use emissions and how the program engages with this.
Yes, so the carbon budget program, the Act refers to legislation which determines which sectors are included in the carbon budgets. And it was decided that that would include both agriculture and land use change and forestry. That's LULUCF. And those are two distinctive sectors. So the agriculture is the emissions that arise from the livestock themselves and the farming activities, and land use change emissions are kind of indirectly related to farming activities and also forestry and how we use land. Agriculture has its own sectoral emission ceiling consistent with a 25% cut in emissions. You might remember the summer of 2022, there was fierce debate among kind of on what agriculture's sectoral emission ceiling would be. It became very contentious within government. And so, the Climate Action Plan sets out policies and measures for agriculture on, fertilizer and organics and forestry separate, and biomethane and so on. That it sets the agriculture sector kind of consistent with the pathway to the sectoral emission ceiling. Land use emissions do not have a sectoral emission ceiling yet, even though the carbon budget program was prepared as if it would be. So that's why I'm saying that if the government intends to remove land use change from the carbon budget program, then a revision of the carbon budgets themselves is necessary for there to remain integrity. And does the program explicitly engage with this? I assume you mean the Climate Action Plan does have targets and policies for those sectors, but we're widely off track what we need to do in terms of afforestation, peatland rewetting, and many would say that the agriculture sectoral emission ceiling is too high because because of this unallocated savings piece. It's the only place where additional savings can be made, but then it becomes politically contentious.
I might just jump in there briefly. I feel like there was a gap in what I had said. There is provision made for these sectoral emission ceilings. It's in section 6C, but they're also referenced in the climate action plan. So in terms of how, the carbon budgets themselves are essentially a number, effectively. It's like, I'm buying a house, what's my budget? I'm buying a car, what's my budget? That's the most important headline aspect of those. But then there is a requirement to break it down sector by sector. But within the overall number. So section 6C is the key part there. And then the climate action plan also has to address that. What I would like to do before you get the next question, Clodagh, which is a question I think Hannah is much better placed to answer than I am. So I'd like to add something to the next question, which is, I came across something recently about grants and the behavioral response to grants for retrofitting houses, electric vehicles, etc. And I've no idea if there's any, this could have been some spoofer, but what was being suggested, and I think I was listening to, was that in Germany and Ireland, they reduced the electric vehicle grant a little bit. Like not, I mean, it went from €5,000 to €3,500 or something like that. And there was a significant reduction in the purchasing of electric vehicles. Whereas in France and Italy, those grants had remained stable, and so the numbers purchasing remained stable. So there seemed to be some sort of group psychology effect where, the signaling of reducing the grants told people don't do this thing, and it seemed to have a significant knock-on effect. There was a very significant drop in the increase in sales of EVs in Ireland in 2024. And I think that's an interesting thing that I think adds on to this third question. I would be really interested to hear what Hannah had to say about it.
Thanks very much, Alan. That's great. And Hannah, and for anyone who hasn't seen the third question, someone has asked, Hannah, how effective do you think the COP process is? So the COP is the UNFCCC Conference of Parties that is on in Azerbaijan, I think, at the moment. And separately, with the general election, what questions do you think people should prioritise re climate policy when speaking to candidates on their doorsteps?
Yeah, this is always a very tricky question about what how effective the COP is, and I think Greta Thunberg was quoted in headlines yesterday for saying it's like a dark joke or a black joke or something like that, and it's hard not to agree with her when the head of state of Azerbaijan, who's currently hosting the ongoing COP29, gave a speech yesterday, which was, I suppose, a defiant defense of fossil fuels, saying that they're a gift from God. Now, some have quipped that, maybe God didn't want us to burn our gift. um, so, it's the third year that in a row the COP has been held in a fossil fuel, major fossil fuel exporting state, and there's something like a circus of grand high statements, but all of the reports that come out kind of informing where the world is at in terms of of keeping warming to safe levels show that we're really so far from succeeding in this. It's kind of bleak headline after bleak headline, really. Uh, there was wide hope that this year we would have seen a peaking in fossil fuel use. I'm watching this very closely. It really depends on what happens in China and other emerging economies. And unfortunately, the headlines this morning are that fossil fuel emissions have not peaked this year. They still grew fairly significantly, and when different international bodies kind of add up where the trajectories of every individual country are heading, given the policies and measures that are in place and the overall commitments, we're on track for nearly 3 degrees of warming, which is, pretty high in the terms of like catastrophic impacts, and triggering, irreversible tipping points in the Earth system. So, from that perspective, COP has not been effective. It's been criticized for being consensus based, where individual countries with a vested interest can block overall agreements. That being said, individual countries are moving much faster. Individual sectors are moving much faster than the collective unanimous agreements at COP. And before the Paris Agreement in 2015, there was no projection of any peaking at all in fossil fuel emissions. So now, like even under current policies, at least emissions are projected to peak and start to decline. That means it will keep getting worse, but at a slower pace. And again, you can't. And I also am fairly optimistic that because the energy transition is so kind of compelling, these, the wind and solar, the cheapest forms of electricity in history ever. Electric cars are often now cheaper, even on an upfront cost basis with no subsidy, than fossil fuel cars. Why we're selling any new internal combustion engine cars is beyond me. Like all of our modeling shows that we have no carbon budget left for new fossil fuel vehicles, yet EV sales are falling because people are kind of concerned about whether they'll be able to get a charger or whatever. It's so like I'm kind of optimistic that once that we've hit these like good tipping points in the energy system, that will make net zero inevitable for a lot of the sectors. But it is about timing. It's not about whether this will happen. It's about how quickly we can make it happen, and also how quickly we can get these really difficult commitments in sectors that can't decarbonize with technologies that are clearly beneficial, like that are win-win-win. That is livestock, that is aviation, that is heavy industry, for example. So that's a very long-winded way of saying that that, you know, COP is a mixed bag. It's a lot of signaling. It's kind of like a marriage, you know, you go up there and you kind of promise things, and you know, your marriage isn't as perfect as you promise it will be on your wedding day, but you know, it's that kind of system is important at the same time. Um, and then the second question, maybe on the general election, and Alan's question. So maybe I'll read out the question. With the general election, what questions do I think people should prioritize on climate policy when speaking to candidates on the doorstep? I said in my article in the Irish Times last week that I think it's most important that politicians or political parties themselves commit to our existing carbon budget program, because manifestos are starting to come out now, and they're kind of committing to individual nice things, you know, more buses, better grants, and so on. But will they actually recommit to our existing carbon budgets, and what will they do to keep the carbon budget program alive? I mean, that is very kind of national, big picture scale. At the doorstep, it's more likely that people will say, you know, here's where I'm having difficulty decarbonizing my own life. The bus isn't reliable. I can't access these grants. There's no minimum BER on landlords. You know, my rented house here is freezing and I can't access any of these grants. It's unfair. What are you going to do to support me to decarbonize my own life? And then the question about grants, yeah, Alan, as I said, I see the new 242, you know, big fossil fuel powered Jeeps, and I just think we're, you know, these people probably say they care about climate change, but you know, it's we've got very different priorities in our minds and different signals. If you, there's car ads everywhere you look that are kind of supporting, that are kind of legitimizing this, and yeah, it's not a good prospect.
Thank you, Hannah. That was incredibly comprehensive. And for anyone who is interested in speaking to politicians about their climate objectives for the next government, Friends of the Earth and Dublin City University are hosting climate hustings next Wednesday. You can join either online or in person. So I'm going to share the link to that into the chat box here. So do go along and attend that if you are available. And I just want to say as well that it's also really important that, you know, not everyone needs to feel like they have to be an expert in climate policy or climate legislation to be able to speak to your politicians about these issues. If someone calls to your door, it's very valid just to simply ask them what they're going to do about the fact that emissions are spiraling out of control, what plan they have to address that, and to do so fairly as well, is also extremely valid. But thank you so much to Alan and to Professor Hannah Daly for your incredible insights. This webinar will be available online. And thank you very much to everyone who attended today and who gave up their lunch break. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone. Okay,
Thank you, Clodagh, and thank you, Alan. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.